Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined today by former evangelical pastor Brian McLaren. I'm going to start right out with the bio. So Brian is a champion for a more loving, inclusive, and contemplative Christianity. A faculty member at the Center for Action and Contemplation, he teaches ways to reconnect with the message Jesus lived and died for, unconditional love. He is the author of Faith After Doubt, The Great Spiritual Migration, and host of CAC's podcast, Learning How to See. So Brian, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you. Happy this podcast exists in the world.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, it's just getting started, and it is fitting that I start with you as one of my earliest guests, and I'll tell you why. I think the first time I ever heard your name, I hope you're okay with me sharing this, but I think it was actually almost as a swear word the first time I heard your name, because I was still, I don't think I was Plymouth Brethren anymore. I was a youth pastor in a Baptist church, but I was very connected to my Plymouth Brethren roots, which is, I know, your roots as well.
Yeah.
And I remember somebody talking about that Brian McLaren, and I won't repeat the things they said, but I'm sure you've heard them all anyway. But it's funny that it was a few years later that I went through my own very painful deconstruction, and everything that I kind of held dear as a fundamentalist evangelical came crashing down, and there was a name that stuck in my head, and it was that heretic Brian McLaren. What does he have to say about all this? And since then, I mean, your work has been so special to me. I've found many of your books. I thought I had read them all, but in preparation for this, I went and looked at a list and found that you've written much more than I've read, but I've probably read 5 or 6 of your books. So it's such a pleasure to have you. And that's sort of where I connected to you. And I think maybe what we could start with, we were just talking a bit before we went on air. And I think what I find is there's always somebody deconstructing for the first time, that each day, you said this, there's somebody new each day. What did you say? Somebody turns 14 each day.
Yeah, 14 or 24 or 44 or whatever. But
yeah, or 60 or
yeah, exactly. And what they inherited stops helping them and maybe starts hurting them, or they feel by participating in it, they're hurting other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's funny for me to hear, because I've had people say to me, like, you're the first person I've ever heard talk about this. And I mean, I'm definitely not the first person to talk about this. And I look back to when I was deconstructing, looking at your work and people like Rachel Held Evans, and of course, Richard Rohr. So I wonder if maybe we could start with a little bit of your story for somebody who might be hearing you for the first time, and talk a little bit about kind of where you came from and how you became a voice doing what you're doing now.
Well, thanks. So I was born in 1956, and a long time ago, and I grew up in a family, loving, wonderful, kind, good-hearted family. I mean, I don't have anything in my family or even immediate church context that was anything like cruel or harsh or mean-spirited. I think it's a lot more common now in those settings, but what I was around people who were very pious, were very sincere, and very fundamentalist, meaning we had to interpret the Bible literally. And we were sort of in competition with other Protestant groups to see who could be the most literalistic in our interpretation of the Bible, because then we could convince people to leave their more liberal or less orthodox churches and come to our super orthodox church. I jokingly, in one of my early books, I talked about it as Church of the Last Detail. Yeah, you might be right on 97%, but we got the last 3% right, And for me, the first real struggle was that I loved science. I loved to read as a kid, and I loved reading about dinosaurs and geology and reptiles and birds and oceans, and I just loved anything, weather. I loved anything about the natural world. And when I realized that my church didn't allow me to believe in evolution and saw science with skepticism, I remember thinking, okay, I forget how old I was, but let's say I was 11 or 12, 7 years and I can get out of here. And that was my first sense that something wasn't working.
Wow. So you eventually became a pastor. How did that journey come about?
So in my teenage years, I was invited to go on a retreat. I was, obviously, when you grow up fundamentalist, your religious identity is the most important identity you're supposed to have. And that was true for me. So when I started having questions and doubts, I was very intensely as an adolescent, trying to sort, who am I going to be? Who do my parents want me to be? Who do my grandparents and relatives and church friends and elders want me to be? So I'm going through the kind of typical self-differentiation that anyone goes through in their adolescent years. But a friend invited me on a church retreat from a different church. We didn't have retreats. I think this probably changed, but in my little denomination, we didn't. It wasn't in the Bible, so we didn't do it. Although, certainly you could say Jesus taking the disciples out into the countryside for a few days could have been called a retreat. But I went on this retreat and had a very powerful spiritual experience that I wasn't really anticipating, that did two things. It got both of my feet on the path of following Jesus, but it gave me a space to do that wasn't only within my inherited religious tradition. And I should also say, this experience happened outdoors. So in that way, it wasn't affiliated with any church. It was this experience,
It's a non-denominational experience.
Exactly right. And so I had this spiritual commitment. I then discovered writers that folks may have heard of now, or they may have already sort of be faded into the past, but writers like C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and others, and they represented a more thoughtful, intellectual version of fundamentalism. And really, C.S. Lewis was not a fundamentalist, but fundamentalists had sort of adopted him. But I sort of gravitated toward the smartest, most thoughtful writers and speakers that I could find. And that continued through my teenage years. I was involved with the Jesus movement. I sort of got my feet wet in a lot of different sectors of Christianity. So that set me up that when I was a graduate student, my wife and I became, we the two of us and another couple kind of started a little experimental faith community that ended up becoming a church. And I was not planning to be the pastor. I wanted to be a college English teacher for reasons we could discuss if you'd like. But at any rate, eventually I left teaching to work with this little fledgling church.
What one of the things I do want to ask about, I want to ask about a few more things about your background because it's so interesting. But one of the things I wanted to ask as you were saying that is the intersection between intellect and faith. I think about it a lot, and even for me as a young fundamentalist, I reflect a lot even now on the role of apologetics in my faith journey and how I think. I'm ashamed to say I think often apologetics was just like trying to get a bigger hammer to hit people with, to know that I was smarter than everybody else and there was good answers for what I believed. But I did come across people like C.S. Lewis, and Ravi Zacharias was a big one for me too when I was a kid. And there's almost, I went to a church in Toronto for a little bit that was a break off of Tim Keller's church, and I used to call it Hipster Church. And it had it was fundamentalist, but it had a very kind of like a intellectual type of veneer.
Yes.
Like what was it about? I guess I'm trying to formulate a question here, but it's interesting to me that correlation between a lot of kids coming out of fundamentalism often find that like you want to read English literature, you want to engage with big ideas. Like there's a hunger there, not just for spirituality, but almost for like a humanistic type of, I don't know, like integration with the human experience. Or can you reflect a little bit on what that is and what brought you to that? Do you know? Or
well, it's such an interesting question. I mean, first, part of this is just intrinsic to human development, right?
Yeah.
Our brains sort of come online gradually through our childhood and adolescence, and it continues through life, I hope. So part of it is just natural human development. We develop new capacities for learning, but also we learn new things, and then we have to fit those new things we're learning into the things that we were previously taught. And that creates something, psychologists call cognitive dissonance.
Right.
I have something that doesn't confirm what I already thought.
Hmm.
And now I'm faced with a choice. Do I attack it, ignore it, pretend it isn't there, call the people who told me this liars and, uh,
Yeah.
the woke leftist mob,
Yeah.
or do I take it seriously and think about it and try to integrate it? So that's a part of human development that's intensified for people born in a very strict religious or ideological community.
Wow.
Uh, and but I think for me as a as a person who was brought up in very conservative Christianity, I was told that God was the God of the universe, that God was the creator
Yeah.
of the universe. I was told all truth is God's truth.
Yeah.
But in those apologists, what I found is my intellect became more and more recruited in service of defending the conclusions that we already had.
Yeah.
So I wrote about this in a book that I wrote a few years ago called Do I Stay Christian? I
Yeah.
called it Constricted Intellectualism. In a sense, we had to be intellectually busy and hardworking and
Mhm.
energetic, but it was within a careful set of bounds, constricted
Yeah.
intellectualism, to defend the confirmation bias, the ideas that our group already thought. And here's where it had a especially intense dimension. When I would do that, I was being a good soldier for our
Yeah.
little army.
Yeah.
And I would get a lot of praise for doing that. I would be really affirmed for doing that.
Yeah.
Whereas once you question or challenge something, you experience some of the opposite.
Did you see your intellect as um, kind of a combination of like a gift from God if you did the right things, but then maybe ultimately a curse if it caused you to ask questions that you didn't like the answer
Yeah,
to?
this is where two things sort of happened. One is that I had had this experience of my own. So I wasn't just going off of what other people told me, right? And whatever I mean by experience, it was, I gave myself permission to have my own feelings and thoughts. And that was the other piece of this. Even when I was very young and I thought evolution was fascinating and I knew my church didn't like it, I had carved out a little space in the privacy of my own thoughts where I had given myself permission to think for myself. I think for a lot of people, they are terrified to do that. And I know a lot of people tried to make me afraid to do that too, which is, when you think about it, that's kind of like a totalitarian regime, right? That's thought policing. And when the thought police create a little inner policeman inside your own head that won't allow you to think, that's a whole lot of power that they've gained. And that happens not just in Christianity, it happens in every religion, and it happens in every ideology. And I've come to see it as part of the struggle of what it means to be human, because we humans are kind of herd creatures, right?
Yeah.
We're
We
very
want to belong,
connected
right?
to a tribe. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess that's an interesting segue to with all of the churches out there, what made you want to start your own little kind of community with another couple?
Well, in many ways, we couldn't find a place to fit in. And it was a struggle for me. I was in graduate school and I had a teaching fellowship. So I was basically part-time adjunct faculty. Right? I was getting a scholarship to teach freshman English and some other courses over time. And so I was in an intellectual community. I knew I could not ever invite anybody from my university world to the churches I was part of, whether they were the Plymouth Brethren churches I'd been born into, or they were the charismatic churches that I had become very familiar with, or I had friends who were Catholic charismatic, and I liked many of them. But I honestly would have been ashamed to bring any of my friends to any of those groups, not because I was just ashamed of Jesus, because I was ashamed of the narrow-mindedness and the hostility, because in almost every church, you constantly had to attack people on the outside to make yourselves feel righteous and holy. And of course, I would be with one group and they would attack another group that I would be with that then would attack the first group. And I just didn't, I felt the people I was around were too smart for that. And they would look at me and think, why are you in a group like this? And I had those questions myself. So a few of us, we thought, could we just form a little experimental fellowship that would try to put love first, love God, love our neighbors, love ourselves in the right way. And so that was really the genesis of that little group.
So
Still going strong. I mean, it's a wonderful congregation in the DC area. I left in 2006, but they're still doing great work.
Well, I guess maybe my question would be, what did it become? What was the kind of evolution of that and your move into ministry with it?
Yeah, well, the challenge was, and I imagine everyone, who's listening to our conversation feels this in some way. Well, I should say, and you might understand this, Chris, for me, becoming evangelical was a step into a much more liberal, open space, because I was fundamentalist and we were the only right group. And to be able to move into a broader group that included, more people was a big step, and it felt great. But it was very clear the word evangelical was problematic too.
Yeah.
Especially as happens when a church gets larger. We had a lot of LGBTQ people in the church, many of them who'd been taught to be ashamed of themselves and to, that there was something disordered about them, that they had to get healed. And I had met enough LGBTQ people before members of my own family came out, that I just knew that the standard script about them was not true. So we always struggled with our identity as a congregation. And I'll just share one brief anecdote.
Yeah, please.
So we tried to sort of walk the line and be acceptable among evangelicals, charismatics, sort of mainline folks. I had done my thesis on a Catholic novelist. I loved so many dimensions of Catholicism. So we weren't an anti-Catholic church. We were this weird combination of evangelical in some ways, because we took the Bible very seriously without taking it literally, charismatic in the sense that we were very free emotionally, and felt that emotion was an important part of spirituality, and we're very oriented towards social justice. We were deeply involved working with refugees, which made us understand how there were in groups and out groups in every society. So we were this weird combination, and we had a leadership retreat coming up, and one of the members of our little leadership team pulled me aside before the retreat and said, Brian, I want to put something on the agenda. You're obviously on a journey. You don't fit in where we all came from anymore. And we have to decide whether this is just your journey or whether it's all of our journey. And I said to him, please don't bring that up. We got enough issues on our agenda to deal with. But of course, being totally uncooperative, and true to his own conscience, he brought it up on the retreat. And to my surprise, the feeling in the room was, this is not just Brian's journey. We're all on this journey together. This is our church's journey. That was a key moment, because what it meant is that we sort of, the church gave ourselves permission to be on our own journey and not have to fit in. And that meant that people would leave and we could say, yeah, we're not for everybody. If this is what you're looking for, and if you think you're right, then obviously you're going to think we're wrong. But here we are.
So was that was the point where you became formally like a pastor? Am I understanding?
No, I had already been the pastor, but it was the point where, in a sense, the leaders of my congregation said, we're all in this together. We've got your back. Let's keep going on this path. And it was a point where they could have said, hey, tone things down. We don't want to scare too many people away. But they said, no, this is important. We are in this with you. Don't let the critics, because there were critics, I had angry emails just about after every sermon. But our leaders basically said, no, we're with you in this questioning. And it's so interesting that the word deconstruction has become the word for that.
Yeah.
A little bit about one other little interesting tidbit about me. I was in graduate school in the early 1980s, I'm sorry, in the mid 1970s into the early 1980s, and and I was exposed to a new kind of school of thought that later became called postmodernism. At that point, it was called post-structuralism, and the word deconstruction really has a meaning in post-structuralism. So I was being exposed to this in my academic studies, and then we realized, oh man, what I was learning about in the 70s and early 80s, by the early 90s, was in the water. Everybody was drinking it. It was out there. And of course, some Christians then became just, violently opposed, not violently, literally, but passionately opposed to anything that was postmodern. It was secular humanist. There were all kinds of terms that would dismiss it. And I know the same thing has happened in recent years with the word deconstruction. Yeah, it's just typical. It happens again and again.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the things that I'd be curious to hear you reflect on is, because it's been happening for such a long period of time. We mentioned at the beginning that some people just are coming to it like today. There's going to be somebody who wakes up this morning and thinks, "Gee, I don't know if I really believe the Bible is the inerrant word of God." But this is a conversation that's been happening for a long time. It's happening under a lot of different names. And one of the things I've been interested, since I've kind of started doing this publicly, and it hasn't been that long, and certainly nowhere near as long as you, people have started throwing things at me like, you were never really saved, or you just didn't understand, or you didn't have a relationship with Jesus, or, fill in the blanks. I think one of the most interesting things about this movement, but I'd love to hear you reflect on whether this is the case or not, that often it is the deepest, not most serious, but like it is often driven by people who are really genuinely searching to engage with tradition. These are not people on the margins who just don't really care. These are people deeply invested who, for the last, what is that now? Is that 40 years since the 1980s? Like, they're now, this conversation has been happening. I'd be curious to know like what that means, and kind of how you've seen the conversation evolve about what we now call deconstruction.
Well, you and I, because we share a Plymouth Brethren background, a lot of people wouldn't know that in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, when that movement was still very young, there was a book written called Father and Son. Now I'm forgetting the author's name, Edmund Goss. It might have been.
I don't even know that one.
And he was, and people will be shocked to hear this, but he was a young, intellectual, artistic Plymouth Brethren boy who grew up and came out as gay. Now, they didn't call it gay, but there were ways, gay people have always existed, and there were ways they survived. And he wrote a book about the struggles with his father, who was an early apologist, who was famous in those days for writing books against evolution and trying to debunk the fossil record. And I remember in graduate school, I heard about this book and I read it, and I just thought, I'm not the first one here, right? But until you find that out, you think you are, because one characteristic of high control, we might call them authoritarian religions, they don't always have to have a single authoritarian leader, but they need to have an authoritarian spirit, meaning there's only one way we think. We give very big benefits to insiders, but there's a very big cost to being insiders. The cost benefit sort of goes together. And the cost is you do not differ from us. And if you differ, then we write you out of history. You just stop existing to us. And that's how then the new generation comes up, and they never find out the struggles of the previous generations, because the story of the good guys always gets retold in a sanitized way. So I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. I forget what year this would have been, 2006, 2000, something like that. And I was in Canada. I was speaking and it was a group of young pastors, all of whom had read some of my books, and they were going through a deconstructive process. It turns out there was a sort of a spy who had come to take notes, because he was, this was the early days of blogging. He was a blogger, and he came to take notes to point out my heresies. And so a few days later, a very vicious blog comes out that gets a lot of attention among certain, if these words mean anything to people, neo-Calvinist or neo-Reform people. And it took, and he accurately quoted me, as I recall, but took the quotes in the worst possible context and framing and used them to make me look as bad as he possibly could. And I actually, kept track of him for a few years because he did a number of things. But the irony was, and the reason I'm telling this whole story, is he sent out emails to all of these young Reformed pastors, both in Canada and the US, and maybe other countries too. And someone was on his mailing list and sent me an email he'd received from this fellow. And the email said something like this: McLaren has a new book coming out.
Okay.
We've made the mistake in the past of attacking him. But if we attack him, we draw attention to him. And so we have to make an agreement. None of us will mention him ever again. And I was so fascinating that I got to see that email, because it was one of the ways that groups maintain their insularity, their isolation from any idea that might disrupt people. And that sort of resonates with your story, because if people even attack those people, then those people become a possible source of an off-ramp.
Somebody's going to say, "Oh, we need to go and listen to what." That's funny. I've had one of my most recent. I guess this is maybe proof that I've either made it or I'm doing something right. But I had William Lane Craig respond to one of my videos and took out all of the arguments and kept all the conclusions and basically just said, "Here's what's wrong with this conclusion." And it was fascinating. I mean, I'll probably do a video on it at some point. I haven't really talked about it yet, but I do find the emotional weight of walking this journey. Like, it's hard enough to walk it as an individual. It's hard enough to walk it just if you're in your own little church going through your own little struggle. Maybe you don't talk about to anybody. Maybe you go away and never talk about it again, which happens. Maybe you're a leader, you do talk about it. And it's, I think both as leaders and as individual people, it's a tremendous weight to go through this process and then to talk about it. You have, what have you learned over the years going through that and being that person? Because, I'm assuming when you saw that email, but maybe you get more immune to it as time goes on, but you see things like that feel like such personal attacks when really you're just trying to be really honest and trying to speak truth. Like, how do you both deal with that as a leader, and how do you see people going through it as individuals?
Oh my goodness, what an important question. And first, I want to say to you and everyone who's going through this, my heart goes out to you. It is not easy. And I never want to forget how terrifying it is to think that the people who you have considered your tribe, many of them in your family, now see you as a dangerous person, and you know what they're praying and saying behind your back and so on. So it isn't easy. Let me say a couple of things about it. I think the place I would start is to say, if you're totally alone, the first thing I'd say is it really helps to find one safe person, at least, that you can talk to, that you don't have to edit yourself. I was fortunate. When I was in college, and some people will be familiar with this terminology, but I met with a fellow for discipleship. It was a one-on-one weekly gathering. And partway through it, I got my courage up one day. I still remember exactly where I was sitting because this took so much courage. And I said to him, "I'm not even sure I believe in God anymore. I'm having a lot of questions about the Bible. I just don't know if I believe any of it." And he was very quiet. He didn't jump on me. I sort of expected him to say, "Okay, well, this is all over. We'll start up again when you get, right with God," or something. He said, I understand you're having these questions. He said, "I want you to know my faith is really, really strong, but I want you to know if you become an atheist and you throw it all away, I'm still your friend. I love you, man." And what was interesting is at that moment that I felt his unconditional love, it was easier to believe in God. And I've gone back to that moment because I remember the feeling of it so much. And I realized part of what was happening is I was realizing that the God of my community was this God who is so exclusive and so elitist and so brittle and mean-spirited and dangerous to be around. And and the reason I was saying I wasn't sure I believed in God is wasn't sure I could believe in that God and represent that God in the world, because I felt doing so would make me a worse person, and I had enough problems as it was without becoming even worse because of my religion. And when he modeled to me an image of God that didn't require me to agree in order for him to love me, that's the God I could believe in. In a certain sense, he embodied something that I could believe in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
And that was a big moment for me. I had at least one person I could be honest with. And through the years, I found, that happened again and again. I'd be around people. And when I wrote my first book, I remember thinking, when this book comes out, I'm going to lose all my friends. I'll get fired from my job as a pastor. It'll all be over. And I lost some friends, no doubt about it. But people came out of the woodwork and said, I thought I was the only one. And a new set of connections develops. One other thing I'll share about that. Some people would know the name of this wonderful writer, evangelical writer, who underneath the surface was far more open than most people realize. But his name was Dallas Willard, and Dallas and I became friends.
Okay.
And Dallas, behind the scenes, was deeply encouraging to me, and just a good mentor and friend. And once we were together, and he'd seen that I for a couple of years, the pages of Christianity Today and some of their publications and online presence became a place where I had a big target on my back. And,
oh my gosh.
And so that just went on and on. And so he saw me, and he'd seen some of this, and he handed me a little handout. Some people might remember something called ditto paper, but it was a way before Xerox and before photocopies. It was a way of reproducing something. And I still remember he gave me this thing. And he said, I think you're going to need this. And it was a prayer from a Serbian Orthodox bishop written while he was interned he was in an internment camp in Dachau during World War II. Yeah. And he had been turned in by one of his priests. He knew he had only spoken against the Nazis to his fellow priests. Okay. And he was in prison, expecting at any day he could be killed for speaking against the Nazis. And all he could think of is, who was the priest who turned me in? And he's just consumed with who betrayed me. And after some period of time, he thinks, I might die. I don't want to die being filled with hatred and suspicion. And so he wrote a prayer, and that's what was passed on to me. If people are interested, if they go to my website, brianmclaren.net, and in the little search bar, put Prayer for Enemies. That's what it's called.
Prayer for Enemies.
And Dallas gave that to me, and it sat on my desk for many years, to the point where I'd almost memorized it. It's a very long prayer, but it pulled me through, because it gave me a way to process the pain of feeling betrayed or used or misunderstood or misrepresented. Those are real things, and it really does hurt. Yeah. And especially, I was closer to your age, and I had a family to support, and I realized what these people wanted to do was destroy my way of making a living. They wanted to destroy me at any cost to get me, and they didn't care. Anything they said or did, it didn't even have to be true. They felt righteous about it, because they were protecting, the tribe. They were being good soldiers. So it helped me a lot to have that prayer.
That's amazing. One of the things that strikes me as so interesting is that we make such a, like, evangelical fundamentalists. When I was growing up, religion meant certainty, and when you lose your certainty, you lose your religion. And one of the things that struck me a lot in your writings, you use the word dissent a lot, and this has been true. I've really benefited from the writings of Richard Rohr too, who I know is your mentor as well. And what we really, I think, have lost the sense in many of the Protestant communities I've been in, that doubt and darkness and uncertainty can be a part of faith. And I think for a lot of people, they come to the point of uncertainty and they think, well, there you go, I guess I'm an atheist, as opposed
Yes.
to seeing that as
Yes.
part of the journey. I mean, I know the Catholics have the dark night of the soul. Like there are different traditions and different Christian communities do maybe a better job. But can you talk a little bit about how doubt and darkness fits with a faith journey?
Yes. Well, first, let me say subconsciously, without ever putting it into words like this, I think that's what attracted me to literature. When I read poetry, when I read novels, they were taking me to deep places with, in a sense, they weren't trying to tell me what to think. They were trying to help me think. They were trying to draw me into the depths of life. And it took a long time before I gave myself permission to realize the Bible is not very good as a book about certainty. It is very good as a book that takes us into the deepest issues of life. But the Bible had been commandeered in Protestant history with a whole very interesting history to it that we could talk about. But it had become a book of certainty, fighting two battles, a battle against Catholics and a battle against atheists. And so the Bible became the defense, a certain defense against the enemies, right? And this I came to realize was not unique to Christianity. I remember years ago reading a book by Chaim Potok called My Name is Asher Lev. And it was a book about a hyper-Orthodox Jewish community where a young boy grows up who has great artistic talent. And imagine being in a hyper-Orthodox Jewish community that makes contemporary fundamentalists look like slackers and slobs, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, their clothing, their hairstyle, their schedule, their diet, everything is strictly controlled. And departure in one area could mean complete excommunication from the group. And this boy has so much artistic talent. And imagine what happens when, as a teenager, he takes an art class and has to paint a nude, right? And his family and his community can't understand how the human body is anything except a tool for sin, and lust. And yet, as an artist, he sees the beauty of the human body. And I remember as I read that book, I felt like I'm not alone. It's not just Christians who have this problem. Years later, I became good friends with Muslims and Hindus and people of other faiths. I remember once a Hindu friend of mine said to me, I was telling, he had read one of my books and we were talking about religion. And he said, I remember when I was a boy and I had a Bhagavad Gita storybook, which is just like a Bible storybook, right?
Yeah.
And it was illustrated with color illustrations. And he said, and in Hindu kind of iconography, just like in Christian, sort of historic Christian iconography, they put halos around the head of holy people to point them out. Well, in some Hindu art, you're painted blue. You have blue skin to show your divinity or your holiness. And so he said to his mother, were Krishna and Vishnu really blue? And his mother said, yes, don't ask questions, just believe what you're told. And so he told me when I was describing in my books my Christian struggles, he went through this as a young Hindu too, right? So it's a human problem.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who's maybe this morning or last week or something, somebody who's fairly new to the struggle? What you already mentioned, find somebody that you can be honest with or that you can tell anything. Like having the benefit of hindsight, what would you say to somebody going through that period?
Well, and the thing I should add to that is that's why YouTube channels and podcasts and so on are so important, because they're a low cost way of saying, I wonder if there's a place for me there. So that's the first thing I just reiterate. We need, and there's a kind of a community of people who listen to your podcast. I'm sure they think if they need somebody else who listens or to your YouTube channel, they find somebody, they think, oh, here's a person who appreciates a safe space to think that doesn't require me to automatically reject everything here. This is a place that allows me to be on my journey, right? That's super important. Another place people can find people like that, sometimes there's a whole tradition it used to be mostly Catholic, but now there are Protestant versions of this, of people called spiritual directors. And I know director sounds like they tell you what to do, but spiritual direction is this ancient tradition that is about helping you listen to your own deepest voice, and to be honest about what's happening that you aren't allowed to admit is happening inside of you. So there's a website called Spiritual Directors Anonymous. You can find people through that. So that I really think is important. I think second, finding podcasts and books, and thankfully there are more and more out there.
Yeah.
You'll find out very quickly you are not alone. You'll find out very quickly every question that you have, someone else has had, and you don't have to be alone in going through it. And one other thing I think I'd recommend is that people get out in the created world, in nature, not in the human-made world, but get out into the most natural places we can, because I think it reminds us that the world is way, way bigger than my little church. Like when you're brought up in a church or denomination, it's the most important social structure after your family. And sometimes it's more important to your family than the family is.
Yeah.
And so realizing I'm part of a bigger world, a bigger story, a story of life, a story that includes the trees and the rain and the soil those would be a few suggestions.
Those are cool. Yeah, that's really cool. The thing that I'm imagining as you're talking about finding other people, you kind of mentioned find one person and then you slowly move towards community. And I'm almost imagining this person who's like in, some kind of fundamentalist community with all these spider webs of connection. And then that person feels all alone and they form maybe just one connection out. And then that becomes two and that becomes three. And eventually you form a whole nother community that you can belong in. So it's almost like a reorienting of yourself away from your home community, maybe towards a new community or a separate side community or something like that.
Another anecdote comes to mind. I as you can see behind me, I have some guitars, and I've been a musician since I was a kid. And when I was a teenager, I picked up the guitar and became a singer-songwriter. And when I was in graduate school, my part-time job was I played at coffee houses and sometimes churches and things like that. So I was out on that circuit. And I was at this event, and there was someone I respected very much. This is long before I ever thought I would become a writer, but this person was a writer, and I thought writers were really cool. Now I know they're just normal, human beings like anybody else. But
no, they're really cool. Let's be honest.
So he was there, and I'm singing all these songs about doubt and angst and struggle and all the rest. And so as soon as the concert's over, he comes up to me, very kindly says, "That was wonderful. I'm so glad I could be here." And I'm thinking, I wish you weren't here because you're now going to think terrible things of me. And so I said something, I just was stumbling over my words. And I said, "I'm sorry, this probably seemed so dark and full of doubt and everything else." He said, "What is most personal to you is most universal to me. Don't apologize for your sensitivity and your honesty." And I just felt like, I was given such a gift. You don't have to apologize. And what he did is he created a little space where everybody else in my religious world might say, "You're doubting, you're deconstructing, you're falling away from the Lord." And they'd have all these, ways of trying to threaten me to come back into the fold, which would mean stop thinking and just agree with them. And here was somebody who said, "No, you're growing. You're becoming who you're supposed to be." And for him to say, "I'm with you in that," was like God saying, "I'm with you in that," which is true.
Yeah.
I think God is on the side of our growth. So
That's amazing. One of the things that I think hit me the most as I came out, I talk about it a lot on my channel, but I'm still finding ways to talk about spirituality. I'm very I studied religion in my PhD, and so I came to see religion as a very human thing, and my Christian spirituality as an expression of humanity, but also an openness to kind of whatever else is out there. So I do talk a lot about this, and people always want to know on my channel, like, what exactly do you, where do you where do you hang your hat? And I'm not even very good at talking about it all the time. I'm getting there. But one of the things that I think was amazing for me was there was a moment, a lot of my deconstruction was very dark and very painful. And I remember lying in bed at night thinking, like, I might close my eyes and die and that might be it, or I might, I don't know. It's ridiculous that as a probably 27-year-old, that was the first time that thought had ever occurred to me.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I was very carefully raised in a community where you'd never even ask that question.
Exactly.
And one of the things there were those moments of darkness, but one of the first moments of hope I remember was a realization that the thing that I had been taught was that God belongs to all people. God doesn't just belong to us. And realizing that in any human creation, in any human society, in any human heart could be the possibility for the divine and for divine revelation. And that was powerful to me to all of a sudden say, like, well, I remember listening to Radiohead, which is really moody, angsty music once, but I was in, and really almost having a spiritual experience listening to Radiohead for the first time at like the age of probably 32 or something. And recognizing that outside of the box that I was given, that I was told, God lives here, this is where you can experience God. And all of a sudden having the world open, that I can experience God anywhere, in any tradition, with any person, with any, any place, any space, that became really, really incredible. I don't know if that, does that resonate at all?
Oh, absolutely. 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 Yes. Yes, it really does. And what you said about religion being a human phenomenon, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's human, and it's part of all of the complexities of our lives, and that certainty we were talking about before. It's not just certainty; it's a grossly oversimplified certainty.
Yeah.
And the simplicity put together with certainty, put together with a community that enforces it, that is the recipe for a high control social group. It wouldn't matter whether it was Christian or Muslim or atheist or whatever. It's a high control setting.
Yeah.
And here's the irony, as I'm sure you've experienced and folks who are listening have experienced. First, a lot of times people feel a revulsion against the Bible because the Bible is used as a weapon against them so much. But as I was going through all this, I was a pastor, so I had to keep preaching the Bible. And little by little, I started finding out things that weren't actually in the Bible, but that were sort of in the subtext or in the assumptions that went into how I read the Bible, right? And one of them was the definition of the word salvation. And for me, salvation had a very clear theological definition that was based on the idea of original sin and based on something called penal substitutionary atonement theory. And there was this whole package. And when I learned that penal substitutionary atonement theory never existed in Christian history before the year 1000, just learning that history, well, how were people Christians before that? And I found that they had very different understandings before that. And there have been very different understandings since. But I remember thinking, well, what does salvation mean? And I just remember somebody dropping a statement that for the Jewish people, of course, when we're talking about the Hebrew scriptures, this is their literature.
Yeah.
The word salvation derives its meaning from the Exodus. It means liberation from captivity, from enslavement, from oppression. And in a strange way, this word salvation, which is used as a weapon against us, you might lose your salvation. The irony is, no, you gain liberation from a very small little world of certainty into a world of wonder and curiosity and possibility. And it's funny that word comes back.
Amazing. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. The word comes back not to haunt you, but to bless you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's so funny. And I remember like the feeling of my own salvation experience when I was 7 or 8 or whatever it was, it was somewhat disappointing, which I don't want to say too loudly because then people are going to say, well, you were never saved. But, you hear these testimonies of people who fell on their knees and wept and felt And, as a 7-year-old, I don't know how much, how much
Yeah.
of that. But anyway, so one of the things I remember realizing when I went through quote unquote deconstruction is that I experienced that sense of euphoria and
Yeah.
peace and freedom just by taking the chains off and letting
Yes.
myself just experience the world such as it was. Even the Bible, I'm trained as a biblical scholar too, so being able to look at the Bible and say, yeah, that's obviously a mistake, that's obvious, or this one's obviously kind of messed up, and maybe we shouldn't follow this part of the Bible, or things like
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, and the irony that for people who have the courage to keep going on this path is just what you said about religion, that religion is a human phenomenon, right?
that. Yeah.
And when we can let the Bible be a human phenomenon, it doesn't become worse, it becomes better. Uh, uh, I said to someone recently, my relationship with the Bible has been a lot like my relationship with my wife. It goes a lot better when I don't require it to be perfect. um,
How do you think, and I know you've written books about this, and we should point to some towards the end, but how what would you say to somebody who's going through the darkness and wants to start coming back to spirituality? It's one of the things that I notice the most. A lot of people, I mean, I do get people who say, like, congratulations, you should be an atheist now. I don't find that a very hopeful or interesting response, but
mm,
a lot of people have that longing, if I could
yeah,
say it that way without slipping too much into evangelical language, but
yeah,
um, they have a desire to stay connected to the tradition, but it's broken in some cases.
yeah,
Maybe they've been abused, even literally abused. In some cases, one of the things I realize still is language. Like, certain things people say just bug me, and it's not because they're bad.
yeah.
It's just because I was so
Unpleasant.
socialized to
Yeah,
that those resonate with a certain type of Christianity that I don't practice anymore. It's hard to reclaim those. And I think it's the most common question I have is, like, where do I start? What do I do to reconnect? Would you have some thoughts, reflections on how to come back to, I don't want to say the faith, let's say come back to a faith or spirituality in
yeah,
some way?
yeah.
You already mentioned a few, I know, but
Well, this might, what I'm about to say might be a little circuitous. So, but I hope I'll be able to keep it clear. When we're in the process of deconstructing a religious faith, we should realize that that religious faith is it's a structure. It's a structure of beliefs and power structures and traditions and music and aesthetic, right? It's a whole combination of things that's part of a larger structure, which is our civilization. And we're part of a global civilization that also has a history. And a lot of people won't be ready for this. I'm just going to mention it. File it away. You don't even have to understand this, much less agree with it. But I'd encourage people to file it away. That your ability to question your tiny little religious structure could actually equip you then to question the assumptions of this much larger civilizational structure
yeah.
that has economic assumptions about how the world works, environmental assumptions about how the world works, and so on. And one of the unfortunate realities of the larger civilizational structure that we're given is that it gave us two options. It gave us the option of a sacred religious world and an unsacred, objective, scientific world.
Mm.
And I think one of the things and that was my long way of getting to your question, because when people say, I miss something, I have a longing for something, I think part of what they're saying is, if I have to move from a sacred religious world with all kinds of narrow, rigid certainties that I don't find tenable anymore, if my only option is to move into this world of mathematics, matter, energy, and no meaning, no depth, no sacredness, no richness, no meaning,
Mm.
that's not much of a choice. You know, that's not much of a choice. Is there a possible option? And I think what is trying to be born in more and more of us, and it's expressed in that longing, is to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could have our eyes open to all the reality and truth from the scientific world, but also the sense that in the religious world is a sensitivity to deeper issues of morality and meaning and story and purpose and connection and a whole language of experiences that are deeply meaningful. And so I suppose what I would want to say is you have permission to take everything that is good and true
Hmm.
wherever you find it.
Hmm.
And there is a depth of sacredness. And I can't help but think this is part of what, is in the parable in the Gospels of the pearl of great price, or the treasure hidden in the field. In the field of fundamentalism, there is a treasure. And I think there are many treasures, and it's okay to say those treasures were put behind lock and key, and I was required to say and do and behave in a whole set of ways. But the treasure, I still can go for the treasure. Now, figuring out what really the treasure was,
Do you
I'll
see
tell
me
you,
stiffen up as you say that, or just like
yeah,
it's?
yeah. Well, maybe I could say, let me
I'm
just
not saying
say,
I disagree. I think
no,
it's true.
no.
It's a lot to take in,
Well, your stiffening up is really part of really important, because
Yeah.
you're stiffening up because you know that the toxicity of that everything is contained in those settings is so great, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, I'll come back to that in a minute, but just to finish
Yeah.
off that thought,
Yeah.
I,
Sorry.
I think I think anything that you stiffen up against, you should stiffen up against. In other words, you have reasons for doing that, but to say there might be something even deeper than that, and the something might have been a deep sense of reverence, that there is something about life that deserves our reverence, um, a sense that there's something that we use the word glory to point to. There's something glorious. And the irony is, you don't need church buildings and praise bands to feel it. You actually can go out in your front yard, and if you're in Canada, there'll be a maple tree nearby, and you
There is.
can look
Yeah.
at one maple leaf. And if you let that maple leaf, if you just observe it, you're going to say, there's glory in that. And to feel the glory of that that's the kind of thing I'm talking about as a treasure that I think is real.
Hmm. Do you find and I think one of the, if we're talking about spirituality generally, but then if we talk about Christianity specifically, a lot of people will go looking for a Christian tradition that fits with their new sort of searching or sense of identity. And even that I think can be problematic. I mean,
Yes.
I go to a mainline church and I love it. And what I'm about to say isn't even about my church in particular, but I was also trained at an Anglican seminary for my MDiv. And I I think a lot of people, leave evangelicalism and say, okay, well, I should go try the Catholic Church. I should go try that. And each of those traditions has their own issues. And I've found my own frustration as somebody in the mainline tradition now, that I think we as mainline Christians have struggled to actually make Christianity relevant and give it gravitas. And often my own experience with mainline churches, again, not the one I'm in. So if
Yeah.
anybody from there is watching, this isn't a critique, but sometimes God is like a nice cup of coffee or a puppy, or let's tell a story about a child on Christmas morning. And it's like, I think there's it's just difficult to find a church tradition to belong to. Or like, do you have any thoughts about that, or how to kind of re-enter the world of institutional Christianity?
Yeah, that's really a great question. And I think you have implied we do the best we can.
Yeah.
And and to go back to marriage, if you think I'm going to find the perfect life partner, your very expectation of perfection will almost guarantee that it's not a good marriage. So
Yeah.
so there is a kind of lowering of expectations to be realistic. And but even the category of perfect and imperfect flows from, has a religious dimension that with deep theological problems, I think.
Yeah.
So I wonder if I could just share a little saying that might help people.
Please. Yeah.
I used to think that things were real and change happened to them. Now I think change is real and things are events that occur in the flow of change. Now, there's a lot of philosophy and so on behind that, but I think I'll say it one more time, and then I'll explain how I think it's relevant to what we're saying. I used to think that things were real and change happened to them. Now I think change is real and things are events that occur in the flow of change. If that's true, then religions are a flow of change. I'm an event that occurs in the flow of change.
Yeah.
I only make sense in this historical context. I'm an event of this world, right? And religions are the same. And then what that allows me to do is to stop thinking in terms of perfect and imperfect. And it helps me realize everything is in the making. Everything is in process, including religion, including the human species. And whatever you believe about God, you have to admit ideas of God are constantly changing. People, if you live long enough, I guarantee, if you're a fundamentalist, you will watch fundamentalism change. It might change from better to worse. It might change from whatever, or it might change from what it is to something much uglier than it currently is. It might just become an older, tireder, more worn out version of itself. That's all change.
Yeah.
And so when you accept that, I think it helps you say, you know what? It's not just Christianity that's a mess. It's religion that's a mess. Oh, shoot. It's not just religion's a mess. Economics isn't doing so well. Healthcare isn't doing so well. Government isn't doing so well. The human civilization isn't doing so well.
Yeah.
Everything is in the process of there's death and rebirth and growth and change. So that might help people. But yeah.
That's a really beautiful segue. I have to hold up two books here. One is Generous Orthodoxy, which is fantastic and everybody should read it. I've also I can't hold up my e-reader, but I had Why Stay Christian on my e-reader. But I've read so many of your books and so many are fantastic. But with the one that you just kind of queued up there, because you're talking about kind of civilizational collapse. So this is your newest book, Life After Doom, which is, I finished reading it, and it's a combination of depressing and hopeful, which is, I think, probably what you were going for. But do you mind talking a little bit about what kind of brought you to write this book and where it goes?
Yeah, and I hope you won't mind me saying I just found out last night that it just won a Nebula. I'm sorry, not a Nautilus Award.
Nautilus Award, okay.
Which it won a silver award in ecology and environment category. So that made me feel very good, because it was a difficult book to write.
Well, there's a lot of chapters that are quite sciencey, and I quit taking science classes because evolution, right? So it was, those chapters were a little bit of not a struggle. They were very easy to read and well written, but it's, ideas that, Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but a lot of us around the world are realizing that we don't just have one problem. We don't just have a problem of climate change. Everything else is fine. And we don't just have two problems. Like, well, we have climate change, but we also have the concentration of wealth and power among a smaller and smaller group of people. And we don't just have three problems. That while that's going on, our religious institutions are not facing our current reality and are dealing with problems of the past, and often are recruited to be part of the problem rather than part of it. And the problems go on and on. When we realize that there's this intersection of different problems, people are often calling that the polycrisis or the multi-crisis. Each different dimension of the problem makes the other problems harder to solve. And what I found when I wrote this book, I was trying to address this reality. And I'll just say the reason this reality has been on my mind is when I went through my own deconstruction, I had to take seriously, what did Jesus mean by his phrase, the kingdom of God? In the Gospels. And and I'd been taught the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven meant going to heaven after you die. But when it became so obvious, I mean, it's even obvious in the Lord's Prayer. We don't pray, may I go to your kingdom when I die. We pray, may your kingdom come to earth, right? On earth as it is in heaven. And so when I realized that, I had to say, well, what's going on earth? If whatever God is, God cares about the earth, then what would it mean for me to start caring about the earth rather than just caring about an evacuation plan to heaven. So that led me to be concerned about the poly crisis, which is the background for the book.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So yeah, Life After Doom. It's a beautiful, well, like horrifying and beautiful, because it really is. There's chapters that are horrifying. We talked about many of the crises that we're facing, but then a lot of hope in there. And I think one of my favorite chapters is called "I Am a Candle," and it was just a really, really beautiful chapter. So I
Thank you.
recommend the book Life After Doom. I recommend any of Brian's books. Brian has spent a lifetime now, I think, writing on all things relating to Christianity, but so many of the things we're talking about, hard to get all of the nuggets of your wisdom into one, hour or so conversation. But Brian, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
It's a real pleasure. I look forward to staying in touch and keep up the good work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.